And once again, as mentioned, we're back with Dr. Tim McKnight and Mike Jakubowski this morning. And, fellas, when we want to talk about some sports-related injuries, whether you're an up-and-coming school athlete or, well into your career, I guess we could say that's something that we need to deal with a lot, I guess, right?
Yeah, this is the time of year we're seeing a lot of those injuries from high school players, junior high, and then just the weekend warrior athlete who, with the weather turning nice, were out running or doing other activities, and they're coming into the office with these injuries. And so we really want to touch on a couple of common injuries like shin splints, shoulder pain from sports where you're doing a lot of throwing. And then there's a particular muscle group or a muscle, more of a tendon along the outside, the lateral aspect of the thigh muscle that goes from the hip to the knee, called the iliotibial band. That's really a tight tendon sheath that can become tight and cause knee pain. And that particular tendon and muscle stabilizes the hip and the knee so that it doesn't over-rotate too much when you're bending your knee in an action like walking or walking up a hill or running. But I wanted to preface the comments by saying two things, two common principles. One is that if a muscle is weak, it tends to be tight, and tight muscles will change your mechanics. So we always have to make sure we have good flexibility and we have good balanced muscle strength. That's always part of the rehab, whether I'm sending someone to physical therapy or Dr. Jakubowski is working on them with his hands. It's keeping that flexibility as much as possible. Mm-hmm. The other common problem that leads to many of these conditions like shin splints and IT band syndrome and shoulder pain are just overuse injuries. So if you're playing softball or you're a pitcher or you're playing baseball and throwing, anybody, no matter how strong they are and how flexible they are, if they do too much, they're going to have a tendonitis pain or a bursitis in the shoulder. So that's why in the professional levels they monitor the pitch count, because they know after so many pitches they're going to start to have these tendonitis kind of injuries. But for the novice or someone who's not fully trained and prepared for spring baseball or softball, it often doesn't take too many throws before there's a problem. And that's usually a sign of weak core strength or shoulder weaknesses, because when you throw, whether it's a softball, you're throwing underhand, or a baseball overhand, you're really throwing with a pretty high force, and it's almost like you've got a mini dislocation of the shoulder. The humeral head of the upper arm muscle almost comes out of the joint a little bit with these repetitive throws, especially when you're throwing hard. Mm-hmm. And that, if you don't have good muscle strength in your shoulders, that will cause a relative dislocation and impingement in the shoulder. If you have a problem with, we call this the kinetic chain, so any joint involved in a movement, which, let's say a pitcher or a shortstop, when you're throwing, you're using every joint in your body. You're using your little toe, your foot, your ankle, your knee, your hip, your core muscles, your shoulder, your elbow, your wrist, and your fingers. So if any of those joints have any kind of dysfunction or injury, it will put extra stress on another joint that's already vulnerable. So you might see one pitcher that's got problems with the elbow and another one with the shoulder. And that really goes back to where is the weakest link in this chain? How do we rehab and how would we fix that? So I just wanted to preface my remarks with that. But Dr. Jakubowski and I have had some kind of fun interactions with patients where they've come to us seeing an orthopedist or some other specialist and not really able to get the relief they're looking for. And when we get to the root cause and we treat either that tight muscle or we correct those mechanics, they heal. So I'm gonna stop and let Dr. Jakubowski talk a little about some of these conditions I mentioned, and then we'll come back and tie it back together.
All right.
Yeah. So what we see typically is, and I think a lot of people know this nowadays, is sports for kids is very involved. Like I look at my 11-year-old son. He plays travel baseball. He's in basketball. They play sports if they like sports. They play year round. So the amount of rest they get is very limited. Now we get into high school and we see some of these athletes, transitioning to college and college scholarships. And as a parent nowadays, and what I notice, it's way different than when I was a kid. we see parents sending their kids for training, so not only are they practicing with their coaches, but they have a side trainer that's teaching them how to pitch correctly or build muscle strength. If they're a runner, the same thing, they're in the gym working out. Football, all those sports, they're just having chronic strain on certain muscle groups. And I feel like in sports now, what we can see, which may be a mistake when kids are younger, is we are conditioning them for one sport that they think they're good at. Okay. And if I condition my one kid to get through high school and get a scholarship, oh boy, that's a home run. That's what I want. Which is great, and if the kid loves it, that's great, but we got to be careful because kids can definitely have repetitive strain injuries. And what I mean by that is they do the same motion over and over again, and we have these micro traumas to muscle tissue or ligament tissue, and a tendency through time will build scar tissue. And that scar tissue leads to poor muscle flow to the muscle tissue, which then can cause adhesions. Again, that's scar tissue on nerves. And what we see happen is the body alters its mechanics to get strain off of it. Okay, then that's just a normal reaction. It's like, okay, I have a lot of pain in this area. There's a lot of stress in this area. I'm just going to change the way I run. I'm going to change the way I throw just to keep pain off of it. And then what we see happen is more and more injury develop from there. So it's really important to find someone if there is a pain or if there is a strain and you have your kid complaining, is to have it looked at. Because they are young, a lot of kids, their growth plates aren't closed. So if we continue with this simple injury or simple pain through time, we could see more of a serious injury develop. And then definitely they won't be playing in sports.
Yeah, so a couple of the common ones that we see this time of year are, one is shin splints, and anybody that's run track or cross country has probably had that. That tends to be a mechanical problem, and when you have a low arch or a flat arch, when the heel, well, it should be almost the forefoot strikes the ground first. Many people hit with the heel first. That's poor mechanics. It's going to really affect your...
They even build the shoes with heel strikes.
Yes, they do, and if you really look at good form running, the best way for your foot to strike the ground is right below your hip, right in line with your hip, and then almost just barely on the ball of the feet, but almost flat-footed, because the ground will push you up. If you hit your heel first, because you're taking a long stride, the ground is going to push you back with the same force that you hit the ground. It's very inefficient. But a lot of people, when they strike the ground with a flat foot, they tend to roll their feet inwards because that arch isn't there to support them, and that inward roll causes the knee to kind of wiggle in a little bit and puts a tremendous repetitive force on the inside of the shin and the muscle that attaches there. So with shin splints, it's correct the mechanical problem. Usually it's an arch support to prevent that pronation or that turning. But that, again, that's a repetitive kind of a problem. So you have to kind of maybe lay off, maybe not as many miles, run on a flat surface. And most runners know this, but some people will run through the pain thinking it's shin splints, and they can end up with a stress fracture in their foot. So you need a good trainer. If you don't have a good trainer, then see a professional can help you, because as we get towards the end of the year, we're talking about sectionals, district, and state. Those are the kind of things that prevent these kids from being able to perform at the level they want to. So that's a pretty easy one to rehab. And I don't know if Dr. Jakubowski...
Can you tape the arches to help that while you're getting through it?
You can. Yes, you can definitely do that.
A lot of people put tape on the shins, but the arch is where it's at, right?
Yeah, you want to raise the arch up to correct the mechanical problem.
So the typical way a parent can actually, if their kid's complaining of shin splints, is everybody's heard of flat feet. If you have your kid stand and you don't see that arch that they're supposed to have in their foot while they're just standing straight up, that's one way to kind of correct those type of things. And typically what I see is someone that comes in complaining of shin splints, kids or whatnot, is to just put a simple orthotic in their shoe, and that could simply correct shin splints. And I would say 75% of the time that could really take care of that, something like that.
Are you able to do active release therapy on
Yeah,
those
so
athletes?
Typically what we see with it's that repetitive strain injury, and we'll do a technique called active release. And what that means is, I mentioned before, is they build scar tissue in the muscle, or these adhesions. And the goal is to, okay, if it's repetitive and we feel adhesion or scar tissue in the muscle, is to tear it down. And the way we do that is we put the muscles through the range of motion while we stretch them. It could be uncomfortable at times because we're tearing down scar tissue, but it definitely helps bring blood flow to the tissue so the muscle can act correctly and then improve their mechanics the way it's supposed to work. And a lot of times we'll see these with the weather getting nicer, is people are running more. They're running outside. And like Dr. McKnight said, track and cross country, we see these athletes. In particular, we just had one come in that Dr. McKnight referred, was, okay, they've been to an orthopedic, they went to physical therapy, and they still had these problems, and he's getting to the districts and the states, he has that potential for a scholarship, and we're trying to figure out this hip pain that he had. This pain down his leg, and Dr. McKnight mentioned IT band, or this band of muscle around the side of the knee and up to your hip. And what we had to figure out is, okay, where's his weak muscles that are causing tighter muscles? And then does he have scar tissue in any of these? And through a couple visits, we figure out, okay, he does have this scar tissue. You can feel it. We tear it down. It's very uncomfortable for people sometimes, but once you have it torn down, in just a couple visits, they can see a huge change. They can run now without as much discomfort, or to the point where, hey, it's gone, and I am actually performing a lot better. Because we corrected the mechanics, it can improve speed, strength, and their ability, just conditioning and endurance can be a lot better just from the treatment.
Yeah, if you're not having pain, you can go longer.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting injury, because in the past I've had problems with this IT band syndrome, especially in my I think it's my left leg where I have this problem, and it's on the outside of the knee, very uncomfortable. And so you have to say, why is it one side and not another? Well, if you're thinking about people that run, if somebody's running down the road, and then they get to their destination, the halfway point, and they come back and they run the next way, they run the same way back. What they're doing is running on the right side of the road, or the same side of the road, both directions. And we know that the road isn't flat because water's got to drain off the road. So actually, every foot strike on the right leg, or the outside leg, is going to be further down that little slope than on the left side. So just the repetitive trauma, if you're doing 10 miles a day out and back, you're going to be stressing one side of your leg more than another. So people don't realize that. So we tell people, don't go out and come back the same way with the same stress on your leg because of the slope of the road. In my case, I think one of the problems was, of course, as we talked about, the gluteal muscles tend to be weak in people that sit a lot, and I'm a sitter. But when I do exercise, it's an overuse injury. I also tend to, because of the sitting and some other mechanical issues, I tend to have a slightly shorter leg on the left side than the right, like maybe a quarter to a half an inch. And when I see Dr. Jakubowski, he can check that, he can see it, and he works the gluteal muscles, and now everything releases and it's mechanically corrected again. But this happens pretty quickly. So people that are really active in sports, they need to have either a good massage therapist or a good qualified chiropractor correct these mechanical problems, because it will continue to be irritated by the repetitive trauma because the mechanics are off.
And this guy you're talking about, we'll wrap it up here, but successful, and he's back to top
Yes,
form.
he's performed some of his top times in track just by correcting some of those mechanics that were slowing him down, and now he has a great chance at state to do very well. So I think the biggest takeaway here is when your kid is training and they're training hard or playing sports and they're playing hard, is to, like every professional athlete, they have massage, they have people taking care of their injuries or just their muscles, is we want to do this with our kids too, especially if they have a lot of repetition, is to prevent injury, especially if you want them going further into those collegiate levels.
Quickly, ice?
Well, there's a lot of controversy, but the scientist who came out with the RICE theory, rest, ice, elevation,
Yeah.
compression, has recanted the rest and ice part. Compression and elevation
Okay.
continues to be recommended. Some people don't agree with that or are not aware of it. There's really no evidence that it does anything to heal the injury. What heals the injury is blood flow, and
Yeah.
when we're stripping the scar tissue out and enhancing blood flow, and then relative rest, correcting the mechanics. That's really where the healing occurs. So again, I would just want to reemphasize that these kids should be having fun in their sports. They should be going at their level, not their parents' level. And some kids are motivated, some aren't, and let them enjoy it. But if they're playing a lot of sports, make sure they have some fun and some downtime, and correct the mechanics.
Thanks a lot, and we'll hope to stay healthy.
Thank you.
We'll talk to you later. There's Dr. Tim McKnight and Dr. Mike Jakubowski this morning on our Talk with the Doc.